So almost 10 years ago, I had this to say to an Australian industry group forum at Parliament House. As one of the hottest and driest continents on Earth, Australia's economy and environment will be among the hardest hit by climate change if we don't act now. It's time to rein in the carbon pollution we have been putting into the atmosphere, and this is something we must do at lowest overall cost to our economy. Well, that was true then, as it is now. And yet here we all are today, rueing the consequences of a lost decade. And what confronts us is potentially catastrophic and made so much harder by the failure to act sooner. It will affect the largest and most industrialised nations, the US, China, the EU, and it will affect even more so the least industrialised nations, those in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. And as you already know, it is already affecting our world. Because the effects of climate change are global, so too must the responses to it be global. And this, more or less, has been the position of Australian governments of both political persuasions, although there have been significant differences in both approach and ambition. Because for one side of politics, the need for a global response has been used as an excuse for inaction. For the other, it has reinforced recognition of both responsibility and opportunity. So this morning, I'd like to touch on why our national interests drive us to more ambitious carbon reduction targets, the relevant international developments that should hasten us in our transition to a clean energy economy, and Labor's approach to meeting Australia's international commitment to reducing global CO2 levels. Hope that's not my phone. The elaboration and articulation of climate policy is like all other policy domains, dependent on a clear understanding of Australia's national interests and confidence in our ability to represent Australian values. Our national interests centre on four core elements: the security of Australia and its people, the economic prosperity of Australia and its people, a stable, cooperative, strategic system in our region, and what I describe as constructive internationalism. Constructive internationalism has a very direct link to international climate change policy, and I shall return to it later. And of course, our values, whether we identify them as respect, inclusion, equality, compassion and trust, are often captured in the expression, the rule of law. The rule of law rests on a fundamental principle. We have value and dignity by virtue of our shared humanity, and that principle is universal. So in addressing climate change as a foreign policy imperative, a value-based, purposive approach to the issue is essential, because it is our values that underpin the principle of intergenerational equity, which is a key driver of a constructive climate change policy. 6 weeks ago, the Fairfax Press reported that the country's largest electricity generators have urged the government to be more ambitious with carbon emissions reductions. So when you even have the nation's largest energy generators combining to urge the government to greater ambition, you know there's probably something wrong with the government's climate policy. And what is it? Well, there are many issues, but centrally it fails to comprehend commercial reality, because of course industry needs investment certainty if it is to transform our energy sector. This sense of urgency has been reinforced by the inexorable growth in Australia's carbon emissions that are putting our commitment under the Paris Agreement even further out of reach. As the government's own data released late December showed, carbon emissions continue to rise, notwithstanding a continued modest decline in emissions from the energy sector. According to the environmental consultants Endeavour, emissions in 2017 were the highest on record, when unreliable data from sectors including land clearing and forestry was excluded. And overall emissions, including land use change, were the highest since 2011. So unless there is a serious change in government policy, there is little likelihood this nation will reach its target of 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2030. And of course, as we all know, every year we delay, that task becomes harder. In fact, the government's own emissions projections show that Australia's emissions in 2030 will decline by just 4% below 2005 levels, rather than the government's own target of a 26% reduction. When I was Climate Minister in the Rudd government, it was my responsibility to land a fair and durable approach to mitigating and managing the effects of climate change. And I have to say most in the energy sector could see the need for action on carbon reduction, and many actually wanted it. And the reason, again, investment certainty and market stability, especially in the context of rapid economic and technological change. But of course there were some who sought to obstruct progress and to avoid reality. In combination with the ideologues, the populists, and regrettably the Greens, they were able to derail the carbon pollution reduction scheme and establish the platform for the short-sighted populism that ultimately led to the repeal of Prime Minister Gillard's suite of legislation after the 2013 election. Ideology and partisanship fly in the face of evidence and science. Who can forget the sad figure of former Senator Steve Fielding, one of your senators here from Victoria, who was unable to reconcile rising carbon emissions with rising global temperatures. He told me very seriously the world was cooling. And who can forget Senator Nick Minchin from my state of South Australia, who believed that climate change was part of a vast left-wing conspiracy to deindustrialise the Western world. And whilst our anointed business leaders, the BCA, the AIG and others, backed the repeal, most of Australia's business leaders have since come to recognise that the repeal of the Clean Energy Future legislation was a massive own goal for this country. It was a massive own goal in many senses. It didn't just stop investment in renewable energy in its tracks and destabilise future investment in dispatchable generation. It pushed up energy prices and destroyed Australia's national credibility as a thoughtful, constructive and collaborative partner in international efforts to mitigate the effects of climate change and to adapt progressively to changed climate circumstances. It's quite a trifecta. And of course the world has moved on, even as large sections of this government continue to deny the evidence and reject any policy proposal that transitions electricity generation. Regrettably, some of the same climate ideologues that we know from the past managed to derail the Finkel Review's proposed clean energy target within weeks, even though it had the support of industry, climate change groups, energy experts, the opposition, and the more sensible members of the government. And now the same group are seeking to wreck the National Energy Guarantee unless it accords a privileged place to coal. So Australia has a fair bit of catching up to do. And this catching up is not just to restore our credibility as a serious contributor to international efforts to address climate change, the constructive internationalism I referenced earlier, but to re-engage as a proactive international climate change policy maker. So addressing climate change will therefore be one of the principal domestic and international policy objectives of a shortened Labor government. You would all appreciate as much as I do that we live in a time of significant disruption. Technological change, demographic and societal change, political change, together with quite fundamental changes in how powerful states deal with the international rules that have provided our global operating system for the past 7 decades. All of these have combined to disrupt the status quo. And of course, climate change is one of the biggest disruptors of all. It has real potential to become an existential threat to humankind. And the current omens are not encouraging. And I'm here now going to reference the IEA report, which I feel slightly embarrassed to do after your presentation, David, but I'll do so in a more amateur way. The report released in mid-March provided sobering data that indicate just how much there is to do if the global community is to reduce carbon emissions to agree that it avoids catastrophic climate impacts. In summary, the report notes that in 2017, global energy demand increased by more than 2%, compared with 1% over the previous 5 years, with China and India driving more than 40% of the growth. Over 70% of the rise was met by fossil fuels. CO2 emissions grew by 1.4%, reaching a historic high of 32.5 gigatons, and global coal demand rose by 1%, reversing the decline over the previous 2 years. But of course, not all of the news was bad. Renewables saw the highest rate of growth of any energy source in 2017, meeting a quarter of global energy demand. And China and the US led this unprecedented growth, contributing around 50% of the increase in renewables-based electricity generation. Decarbonising the economy while maintaining economic growth remains at the centre of Labor's approach to climate change policy. And this goal highlights the fact that effective climate policy does not mean an end to improved living standards. It means taking full advantage of new opportunities and new technologies by placing real economic value on a stable climate. In a significant statement to the Lowy Institute in late 2015, Bill Shorten, the Leader of the Opposition, outlined Labor's approach to climate change. He made clear that under Labor, Australia will do its fair share in achieving the internationally accepted and bipartisan goal of limiting global warming to 2 degrees, although of course the scientific literature suggests that this is becoming increasingly difficult. This goal translates to an Australian fair share of a cut of 45% of emissions by 2030 based on 2005 levels, and this is Labor's 2030 emission reduction target. And as part of ensuring we see the necessary decarbonisation of electricity generation, which impacts directly on the emissions of other sectors, we will ensure that 50% of electricity generation comes from renewable sources by 2030. 3 years on and 1 election later, those goals remain intact and unchallenged as the basis for sensible and effective action on climate change. Labor's key focus in the lead up to the next election is therefore on a durable mechanism to achieve those goals. We do doubt that Prime Minister Turnbull has the ability to deliver a carbon reduction mechanism that best fits the problem. But if he can, we cannot afford to repeat former Prime Minister Abbott's short-sighted and counterintuitive mistakes. And whilst we have strong reservations about the targets built into the government's National Energy Guarantee, if it does not lock in weak targets and has the potential to provide a mechanism through which we could realise our national targets, then we are open to it. It may not be the mechanism we would have designed, but as Mark Butler said recently, if the NEG is implemented rather than scrapping it, if possible, a future Labor government will build on it by legislating to lift the policy's emissions reduction target for the electricity sector to deliver Labor's stronger national target. So whilst Australia has remained in a wasteland of coalition denialism, intransigence and gesture politics, the rest of the world has moved on. Other speakers will no doubt deal in detail with what's happening elsewhere, but I'll just mention 2 indicators of where things are going. China has acute environmental problems, particularly with respect to air pollution and air quality. And in the interests of its people's health, China has moved quickly to reduce industry's reliance on coal-fired power production. As reported by the World Economic Forum, China's megacities such as Shanghai, Beijing, Tianjin, amongst others, plan to run entirely on renewables, including in the transport sector. And China is intending to build a demonstrator at an indicated cost of US $350 billion over the next decade. But China's move to renewables doesn't only reflect its concern for people's health. It also sees renewables as a key to sustainable economic growth. And frankly, China's decline in energy intensity is remarkable. According to the World Bank, between 1980 and 2010, China's energy intensity per unit of GDP declined by 70%. As its economy grew by a factor of 18 times, its energy usage grew 5-fold. Turning now to the US, you are all aware that President Trump's decision to withdraw from the Paris Accords was met with disappointment by both the coalition and by Labor. Just last week, President Macron called on President Trump to make our planet great again by rejoining the Paris Agreement. But of course, irrespective of the administration's position, the rest of the US is not standing still. Individual US states are reshaping their economies. According to Forbes magazine, the state of California, for instance, plans to produce 60% renewable energy by 2030 and 100% renewable energy by 2045. At $2.6 trillion, it has the largest GDP of any state in the US, around 14% of the GDP of the nation. Massachusetts is also considering a state bill requiring 100% renewable energy by 2050. And even individual Americans are putting their shoulders to the wheel. Realising a promise made in June last year, I read that the former Mayor of New York, Michael Bloomberg, announced last week he will commit $4.5 million to help defray 60% of the US contribution towards establishing the UN Climate Change Secretariat. With my colleague Mark Butler, I intend to pursue the foreign policy aspects of climate policy with renewed energy, because if Australia continues to stand apart from the mainstream of countries seriously attempting to address climate change, we fail to honour what we stand for, our values, and we will fail to deliver on our national interests. No doubt Mark will provide much more of the detailed content of climate change and energy policy. But where our responsibilities intersect is in ensuring Australia's international standing is supported by sound domestic policies that deliver our international obligations. On the international side, we do need to restore Australia's credibility and Australia's reputation as a creative, collaborative, energetic member of the community of nations that actually want to get on with reducing emissions, designing and implementing global targets and staying within the 2-degree limit, as we can and must if we are to meet our international obligations. Australia's credibility and standing took a tremendous hit when the carbon price was repealed. Before Prime Minister Abbott was elected, we had a growing reputation as a forward-thinking and serious contributor to global climate change policy, due principally to the excellent work done by senior Australian officials and our diplomats, and by many of you in this room. When Australia ratified the Kyoto Protocol under the newly elected Rudd Labor government, I was quite literally able, as the newly appointed Minister for Climate Change, to take our seat immediately at the International Climate Policy Head Table in Bali at the end of 2007. In the last decade, Australia built up a valuable reputation across all the technical areas of climate policy, from carbon pricing mechanisms and accounting regimes to forest and land use. We were respected for the ability of our specialists to bring a sound evidence base to the development of globally effective policy to underpin credible and durable and effective international agreements. And that's what has been given up. And as with so many of the coalition policies, such as the constant hacking at the aid budget, this approach has diminished Australia's influence and voice in the world. Well, the Shorten Labor government is determined to turn that around. I mentioned earlier that constructive internationalism is one of our core national interests. In a time of disruption such as we presently face, it becomes even more important that middle-tier countries such as Australia act in collaboration with our neighbours and other like-minded nations. Constructive internationalism is a truly strategic concept. It was when Gareth Evans promoted it as good international citizenship, and it has become even more so as we seek to hedge against the consequences of disruption. And make no mistake, rising levels of atmospheric CO2 are, along with nuclear weapons, amongst the most disruptive issues confronting humanity. Constructive internationalism is the best tool available to us for dealing with wicked problems in the international political domain. And as you know, wicked problems are the multi-dimensional, multifaceted problems that can find no single nor comprehensive resolution. Wicked problems have 3 major components. 1, there is a multiplicity of matters that affect many stakeholders. 2nd, those stakeholders are affected in many ways. And 3rd, the complex of issues requires the stakeholders to come together to identify avenues for resolution. Constructive internationalism generates international public goods that reflect our values and meet our national interests. By working cooperatively to resolve such wicked problems, we create critical international public goods, such as an effective global response to climate change. These are public goods from which we all draw benefit, even when the economic, environmental and security returns may be different in kind and in distribution. And what is it about? It's about forging associations. It's about forging alliances and partnerships to act in the common good. It's about bringing to bear our national policy skills, which are considerable, to help shape the international rules that underpin common purpose. And it is about an energetic, focused and sustained diplomacy to both instigate new approaches to wicked problems and to marshal the combined efforts of partner countries to deliver effective long-term action. I think of constructive internationalism as a kind of cooperative self-interest. And in many ways, that's what makes it so attractive to partners. And one of the clearest indicators of constructive internationalism at work is strong and effective international institutions. And this is nowhere more true than in the climate change domain. Here, our neighbours are particularly important to us as climate change partners, whether they are the Pacific Island states facing catastrophic consequences from rising sea levels, or the Asian region and the riverine delta states facing recurrent inundation of croplands. It is important that we recognise that the institutional tools for realising our constructive internationalism national interest are already to hand. In January, I spoke at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore, and I made the obvious point that ASEAN is central to delivering long-term peace and prosperity in Asia. I went on to identify it as the linchpin in Asia's role in a globalised economic world, with a growing role in the maintenance of the global economic system and the rules that support it. So it's no surprise that Labor will place renewed emphasis on the climate change work we do with ASEAN members and seek to build the collaborative arrangements that we and they already have in place. And similarly, we will be working to strengthen and broaden our climate change work in the Pacific through the Council of Regional Organisations of the Pacific and its principal subsidiaries, the Pacific Islands Forum, the Pacific Community and the Secretariat of Pacific Regional Environmental Programme. And, of course, we are willing to work with other third parties, whether they are the major institutions such as the ADB, the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Secretariat of the UNFCCC, and, of course, the Green Climate Fund. The second way in which I propose to rebuild Australia's credibility and standing in the climate change domain is through rebuilding the technical and professional skills of DFAT staff. As many of you would know, Australia is very well served by its foreign affairs staff. They are an extraordinarily dedicated and hard-working group of women and men who cover an extended range of disciplines, but they are spread thin, with virtually no redundancy in the system. Not only have the numbers of officers posted abroad been cut over the past 2 decades, but more importantly, core skills have been lost. A principal focus we want DFAT to have is the reskilling and re-professionalising of their existing talent. Through career learning and continuing professional education are critical if we are to be able to generate the opportunities and address the threats that this time of disruption brings with it. It is my intention to look at a number of you here this morning, should we win government, to assist DFAT in strengthening these professional competencies. And the third step I'm proposing to take to restore Australia's international reputation and credibility in the climate change domain is to reinstitute and rebadge the position of climate change ambassador. Unlike the Abbott and Turnbull governments, we aren't politically allergic to the term climate change. I wish to conclude with 2 final observations. First, none of us should underestimate the urgency attaching to clear, decisive and effective action to reduce carbon emissions and to reduce the global carbon load if the community globally is to live within the limit of 2 degrees. And whilst we all know that goal is challenging, we equally know that the determination to do so is not yet there. And second, if we are to build that determination to limit global warming to 2 degrees, then we need to build the coalitions to achieve that, to develop the evidence-based policies that are the key to concerted action. We need to build our powers of advocacy and our skills at persuasion to ensure that all nations see it in their national interests to protect our little blue spaceship, or as the cosmologist Carl Sagan put it in 1994, our pale blue dot. Many of you will recall the astonishing photograph taken by Voyager 1 as it turned its camera back towards Earth for one final image before it exited the solar system and headed into interstellar space. From 6 billion kilometres, the faintest blue dot can be seen in the void of space. Sagan captured the starkness of our plight with great poignancy, so I shall end with his words. Our posturings, our imagined self-importance, the delusion that we have some privileged position in the universe, are challenged by this point of pale blue light. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint of help that will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. It has been said that astronomy is a humbling and character-building experience, and there is perhaps no better demonstration of the folly of human conceits than this distant image of our tiny world. It underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known. Thank you very much.